A personal curriculum is only going to get you so far, right? If what you are really trying to do is develop your critical eye or what we can call your intellectual taste, you're going to need a little bit more than that. And specifically, you're going to need to start developing a thesis. If you're new here, I'm Vale. I am sharing a lot about how we might keep our brains and minds active in a world that is so heavily pushing us into a state of disassociation. I have spent my entire career working in education. Now I work in student and adult learning design. And so I spend a lot of my time thinking about how people learn. And recently I've been seeing a lot online that signals to me that people have a desire to keep, again, their brains active, to keep, their critical thinking abilities sharp, and to potentially move away from the harmful habits that we have picked up that maybe make it more difficult to engage with the content that we are consuming. Today, I want to talk about the thesis statement, which is, yes, something that you have heard before, probably in your English high school class. So it should be something that feels a little bit familiar, but it also potentially is something that you've built some blocks around. And so I want to encourage this to be a fun process that allows us to connect the many different pieces of the media that we're consuming. So I'll spend a little bit of time talking about this with you all today. So I'm sure that you've seen the viral videos online around creating your personal curriculum. And I think the goal here is really to take a deeper dive into things that interest you, things that you have maybe questions and wonderings about. So it's a way to sort of inspire intellectual curiosity, but also it is a way to, as people have said, become so well read that you are somebody who can talk about, discuss, connect a variety of different topics, and in that way sort of develop your intellectual style. I've also seen a lot online about the habit of keeping a commonplace journal or using a digital tool like Obsidian to keep track of the content that you are consuming and to start to make note about that content. So to me, that's very interrelated, right? Because on one side, we have the personal curriculum. On the other side, we have the commonplace journal or Obsidian. And I think that they're coming from the same place of, again, this mindless kind of brain-numbing scrolling that we've been doing since the pandemic, and realizing that maybe our cognitive abilities are not what they used to be, right? And so one tool, which is the commonplace journal, is asking you to, again, consume your content a little more mindfully and make a note of it, right? And start to reflect on what that content is. And on the other side, it's like, all right, if you also want to do something that is enriching you, that isn't just mindless scrolling and content, build a personal curriculum and become more well-read and learn about the topics that you're interested in. And so to me, those two things are related. And I do think that there is something missing, right? There is almost a step missing in each of those things because it makes a lot of assumptions about the people who are trying to take on these habits, right? Or to, use these tools. And it assumes that they know how to process information or that they have a tool that they can use to better leverage that learning that they're doing. And to me, that tool is the thesis. Okay, we're going to think about those two things separately. We're going to think about how you might leverage a thesis when you are using a personal curriculum and when you are consuming media or content in general. Before we do that, I want to give a base definition for thesis, because I know that there are a lot of many different definitions, I think, that have been used at many different levels of academia. But for this particular video, when I say thesis, I mean 1 to 2 sentences that clearly state your opinion on an issue and gives the main reason for your argument. Okay, so that's how we're going to think about it. We're going to think about it as 1 to 2 sentences that are clearly stating your opinion. So what I'm really asking you to do here is something that is really fun, which is to have opinions, right? To have bold opinions. This is where you'll start to develop your critical eye. When you start to say, this is my opinion and this is why, and then you allow for that to either, again, change or to be reaffirmed or to be complicated, right? So that is where that critical thought starts to happen. But that is our definition of thesis. So now let's talk specifically about how you would use a thesis when looking at a personal curriculum. Okay, any good thesis is going to allow you to step a little bit more deeply into discovery, right? Because you are now working toward understanding that thesis a little bit better, or even just complicating it, right? Changing it, right? There's more meat for you to play with as you begin your academic study. So in a personal curriculum, right, when you are looking again at a specific topic that you find interesting and then doing a deep dive of learning around it, it helps to have a starting claim that you can check back against as you begin your reading. There's a reason that you chose this topic for your personal curriculum, right? Whatever it may be. There's a reason that you chose it because it's something that speaks to you. It's something that maybe you've been thinking about that, has been sort of sitting with you in the last few years. And so that means that you probably already have opinions. And that is the first thing I want you to think about when we think about thesis, right? You can pull from your own personal opinions about the world and then find evidence to either support it, challenge it, or even complicate it, right? And so when we're looking at our personal curriculum, we have a topic. What I'm inviting you to do is to write 2 to 3 thesis statements that you can then check back up against as you're reading. And this is going to help you more fully engage with that text, okay? Because now you're going in sort of saying, these are 3 things that I said that I kind of believe about this subject area. And now when I'm reading, if I find evidence that clearly challenges that, I was like, I was wrong, like I did not, right? I can go in and write down that evidence. And now I have something to grab onto, right? There's something where my learning is grabbing onto that statement. And that is what makes learning sticky. So even though this is like a very simple strategy, write down 1 to 2 sentences about something that you believe about this specific topic and maybe a reason why you believe that. It is giving your brain something to stick onto as you go deeper into this learning. Okay, so now let's look at an example of what this might look like so that you can sort of see this is how I would approach a personal curriculum. Okay, I'm going to write my personal curriculum on fashion history because I've recently become obsessed with sewing and the world of fashion in general, construction in general. And I've always just loved history. I was a history teacher before I went into other types of education work. And those are just 2 interests that I'm like, okay, fashion history, like I've been dying to know more. And so I went ahead and started putting together a little curriculum for myself with different books, different movies to watch, different maybe potentially museums to go to when I'm in New York or when I'm like, in the States again. And so I've sort of put together a little list. But before, I haven't even jumped in, right? Because I haven't done any of this learning yet. And so before I even jump in, I'm going to write 3 theses, right? Based on a couple of things, right? Some things that I know, some things that I'm like, I kind of know that to be true. Some things that I'm like, I think this is true. And I like, kind of like do think that this is my opinion. And then also like, even just looking at the books and the things that I put together, I'm like, okay, I think I'm going to learn some things about this. So let me write a claim. I could probably write 10 claims here because there's so many different directions my brain goes into when I think about fashion history of the like many different intersections, the many different types of like avenues I can take my learning into. I can think about like manufacturing, but I could also think about sustainability, but I could also think about like, early US history and quilting. Like there's so many different directions. And so again, this is why the claims are important because they help sharpen my direction. They give my brain something to cling on to. And then later, if I want to write another thesis, go a different direction, I can do that, right? So these are the 3 theses that I will be writing or that I'm writing down for this curriculum before I even jump in. The first is fashion is a tool for oppression because dress has been used to enforce racial and class hierarchies. The second is mending and repair can function as resistance to capitalism. And the third is capitalism killed personal style. Okay, as you can see, not a lot of evidence for these, right? Because this is a thesis that I'm beginning, right? These are things, again, that I'm basing off of what I already know, what I might kind of think is right, and then also just in general, maybe a bold statement, right? These are bold opinions, and that is what makes them fun. And so what's going to happen now is that I am going to jump into that learning, right? I am going to go in and read my book, maybe one at a time, and then I'm going to pause Okay. And as I read, because I already have a thesis, you'll notice that your brain's already going to start being like, this affirms it, this doesn't, this challenges. Because again, you have something to cling on to. The other thing though, is that after I consume a piece of media, whether it's a book, a documentary, etc., I'm going to pause and I'm going to go back to where I wrote down my thesis. And if I didn't already say that, it's really important that you write down your thesis. That is another cognitive thing that is going to help this become sticky. So I'm going to go back to where I wrote down my thesis and I'm going to say, did I learn something that supports this? If so, I'm going to write it down. Challenges it, I'm going to write it down. Complicates it, completely asks me to change this, I'm going to write it down. There's a possibility that I read a book that doesn't answer one thesis, but maybe it helps answer the other two, right? And this is where I can stretch my thinking. But I'm going to go and do that reflection activity, and then I'm going to move on to the next piece of media. So again, I've made it sticky. I've found myself with something to write, with something that like is bubbling in my brain. There is also a possibility that after reading that book, I might have another claim, something that came up as I was reading. And I was like, wait, there's this whole other thing here that I didn't even consider. And I'm going to make a note of that as a claim over here. So again, this is from one claim springs many. And that's the exciting thing, because that is how your brain works. From one idea, it jumps to many. And so all we're doing is giving it an avenue to write it down for you to like actually be able to cling on to that. Okay. So let's say, for example, let's take it back to our example and let's consider how I might add to my thesis. Okay. So for example, when we're looking at this first thesis, let's say that I read the book Empire of Cotton. And that actually helped me affirm this particular thesis. I would write down whatever evidence from Empire of Cotton either affirmed, complicated, challenged my thesis. But let's say that I also started to talk about this book or this thesis with other people. I was sort of bringing it up with my friends at lunch, and I was like, I'm reading this book and I'm thinking about it through this lens. And then they had opinions and they were like, well, have you heard about this? Or have you read about this? Well, I'm going to write that down too here. So I'm not just pulling from my personal curriculum. I'm pulling from everything around me. That's how learning really takes place. So you pull from the world around you, from sources, from conversations with people. All of this is helping form your worldview, your critical eye. So I'm going to also write down whatever thought came up for me as I was talking about this with a friend. And then potentially I'm scrolling social media afterwards, right? And I'm looking at different TikToks and short form content or whatever. And I find something or I watch a video that maybe helps me, again, think a little more deeply about this thesis. Maybe gives me an example of how this is true. I'm going to write down that evidence from the TikTok. And so even though, again, I'm looking at this particular thesis statement through the lens of my curriculum, all of the learning around me, not just in the reading, but from conversations, from short form content, are collecting under this statement and are helping me think about it a little more critically, are helping me, communicate about it a little more clearly. Okay, and that's really it, right? That's how you use a thesis statement with a curriculum. You write a few at the beginning, you jump into your curriculum, you come back to those thesis statements, you make them meatier, you complicate them, you challenge them. And then you also bring in other pieces of evidence from the world around you and from your conversations with friends. And that's something that I would really encourage you to do with these thesis statements, right? Share them, talk about them. And that's really where this idea came from, right? And it was kind of a running joke between my husband and I, because I had sort of these funny thesis statements, and every time some piece of evidence would come up, my husband or I would be like, add it to the evidence for the thesis, right? And it was kind of a joke, but it actually has become a true thing that I do now, right? I have multiple thesis statements. People around me know, they send me things, and it becomes sort of this thing that like people are aware that I either believe jokingly or really I'm working to understand a little bit more. So I would say that this is a really good tool for that, especially also if you're somebody who's trying to write a little bit more and think about how the connections between the world around us are adding up to a bigger idea. This can help you organize that writing as well. But I also want to name that you don't have to do this through a personal curriculum, right? We all consume content. And so there is another way to use this strategy if you are just the regular content consumer like most of us are. Okay, the way that you would approach this is a little bit different because we're going to flip the order of the thesis. So instead of writing the thesis and then consuming the media, we're going to do the opposite. We are going to write a thesis after consuming the media, okay? This is because we sometimes fall into these scrolling, sort of doom scrolling spirals. We've consumed all of this media around a specific topic. It can be something like TikTok drama, or it can be the war, right? Like you consume all of this and then you have no way to process it or no way to sort of organize the many different thoughts and opinions that you're hearing about a specific topic. And so what I would push you to do in that situation is to pause when you're feeling like you're in this topic and you're really in it. You're looking at videos from many different directions, reading posts about it from many different angles, right? I would ask you to pause, go to that commonplace journal or just a regular journal, and write a thesis statement, right? Based on everything that you've consumed, what is your initial thought about it? Who are you like agreeing with? Are you agreeing with this side, this complicated? Are you saying this, but this? Write it down, get it to a couple of sentences. That's going to be your working thesis statement, okay? And so I'm not saying stop consuming that content, although sometimes doom scrolling maybe can do that, but I'm saying now push yourself to write those 1 and 2 sentences that help explain your opinion about something and why that is your opinion. That is a processing tactic. And again, just like with the personal curriculum, you can go ahead and add examples from everywhere around you, from your conversation with people, from your conversations at work, from the media that you're consuming online, but also from any sort of outside media, from museums, from, art. Well, that's the same thing, but you get what I'm saying? Like you can pull evidence that helps shape this opinion a little bit more, makes it meatier. But what it does also is it breaks that cycle of mindless scrolling when you're like, I'm going to write a thesis about it, right? And then if I can keep consuming, but I have to come back to this and add to it and complicate it every time I see another piece of media. So if you're somebody who's been looking into that Obsidian tool or trying to use a commonplace journal, this is why I was saying earlier, you might not have had the tool because it can look like an empty page in front of you. And it's like, what do I say about this content? Instead, push yourself. This is the task, right? 1 to 2 sentences about how I feel about this specific topic. And now when I'm consuming media, I come back to this. It either is affirming, challenging, or complicating my thesis statement, okay? I'm gonna give you an example of how to do this. Okay, the other day I found myself deep into a little bit of TikTok drama, so that's the one that we're going to talk about, and there are 3 different creators or people or issues that you need to sort of know off the bat. The first is that there was this one creator who made a video talking about the ways in which we develop personal style, right? And the idea or the thesis that you cannot develop personal style only on the internet. You have to go out into the world and experience it and go to museums, listen to music, and have friction with the world in order to develop your personal style. There is no way to do personal style solely with interest. So that's the first person. Then there was this second group of creators, and they are, I believe Australian. They have a podcast, and they basically took offense to this first video and did a whole podcast episode about it, called it elitist, and basically said that some people can curate, that you can have personal style only on the internet, and that not everybody can go to museums, and et cetera, and just being defensive about the idea of how to develop personal style, and kind of sent all of those podcast followers toward like an attack toward the first creator. Then I consumed another piece of media, and that's by a third creator who is now commenting on the situation, which is something that we see a lot on TikTok, right? And that person was somebody with an art background or a background in design, and had been in a lot of rooms where different decisions had been made about fashion design, and was speaking about what the true creators, right, the true fashion artists or the true artists in general, how they experience the world, and why their way of thinking is often mimicked, but it is hard to replicate, right? So her point was that there are only a few of these people, and they have a very specific outlook and very specific taste about the world, and they've developed that through interactions with the world, right? By being present in the world, by listening, by looking, by seeking art, right? And so that was her point to add to that conversation of like, in her experience, in her lived experience, the only way to develop taste, and the people who she has seen who have the most taste are people who have gone and done these specific things. So I was in this cycle, and there was a lot of videos that I saw on this. It wasn't just this. There was like a lot of conversation. And so again, I could just kind of consume this and have my opinions here in my brain and just let it go. And that's how I consume content a lot of times. Or I can pause and say, actually, I just watched a lot of videos about this. So that means I've invested my time in it. And what is my return on that? Let me write a thesis statement that I can then bring up in conversations, in my writing, and I can develop, right? I can check back and add to and have, like, again, that developing critical eye. So this is the thesis that I would write. Let's go ahead and take a look. Okay, so here are 3 different groups of content creators, and here's my thesis. It is impossible to develop your personal taste without experiencing the real physical world around you. And that's really it. Like, that's my statement. I wrote it down, right? And so now, even though it's only been a few days since I wrote that down, I've consumed many different pieces of media that help sort of affirm or complicate that, right? And help me consider things like, privilege and art and all of these different things, but also, that help me consider how does a person who wants to be creative have to engage with the world, right? And so it's given me something to take away from the mindless scrolling that I was doing and something to put in my commonplace journal that I can actually build on. So it's not just like an empty topic that I don't know what to write. And so that is the power, again, of the thesis, of giving you something to hold on to sink your teeth into, and to stay a forever learner in this world. And that is all that I really have to say about thesis, but I do want to invite you to write a thesis statement this week. So if you find yourself later today or later this week scrolling through TikTok or through Instagram and liking a bunch of videos, take a little pause, stop after an hour, and see if you can find something that you found really interesting that you want to write a thesis statement around. Write it down on a piece of paper and see if throughout the week you can come back to it, add to it, complicate it, challenge it, affirm it, right? And how that starts to build your critical eye and your view of this particular subject matter in the world. Okay, I will continue to share more about how we might develop our intellectual taste through the lens of educational tools. So if that is something that you're interested in, stick around, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you next time.